1776 to 2026, Jubilee, Shemitah, 10th Jubilee, 11Q13. When growing up in the education of the Catholic school, the nuns taught us that the Triune Trinity Doctrine was the greatest mystery. They said the keys were given to Peter. Yet Peter never believed nor was taught the Trinity or the God, the Eternal Son. The Bible explains the mystery of the key of David and is resolved with the crucial application of eternal righteousness, John 1:1, the Alpha and the Omega of He who made the law of two. That presents the two eternal fathers in reference to the order of Melchizedek and proved by the divine prerequisites. The prerequisites are defined in Hebrews 7:1-3. Please listen here. The prerequisites explain and define the lamb that was slain prior to the foundation of the world, Revelation 13:8. The fact is, this eternal righteousness is a profound, a divinely ordained, masterful theological fact, but it has to be properly articulated vocally in the following way. What was the ministration of Melchizedek? Explain and define. What was presented to Moses as the starting point, the temple in heaven, Hebrews 8:1-5, then the altar in the court, the primordial revelation of the work of Melchizedek in the heavens as eternal righteousness. In the form of the Melchizedekian prerequisites. Where then is the final revelation on earth in the form of Revelation 13:8-9? Is in contrast to the human, false mitzvah of the mark of the beast. For Laodicea, it involves the recognition of the commencement point at 6 a.m., which was eternal righteousness prior to that time, in the form of the Alpha ministration of Melchizedek. And this is proven by way of 11Q13, where it says, in the fragmentary passage, the term Elohim appears a dozen times, mainly referring to the God of Israel, but in commentary on who says to Zion, your Elohim reigns, Isaiah 52:7. 11Q13 states that Zion is the congregation of all the sons of righteousness, while Melchizedek is your Elohim, who will deliver the sons of righteousness from Belial. And you can see this information here. 10th Jubilee. A thoughtful person would acknowledge the 10th Jubilee would have to somehow have alignment with the counterfeit 10 kings of Revelation 17. Especially that counterfeit jubilees are in fact counterfeit ministrations of the concept of the priest-king alliance. In the historical setting of 7 kings, Revelation 17:10, and there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come, and when he cometh, he must continue a short space. The final 10th Jubilee involves Melchizedek and the Day of Atonement, just as you read from the articles on 11Q13, and therefore involves the millennium and the putting away of Satan into the bottomless pit. This is the fastest way of shutting down the Laodicean, and anyone else for that matter, who are the so-called defenders of Christ, insisting he was God, the Eternal Son. Right? The fact is, the typical earthly jubilees, or Shemitah, never resolved the sin problem in sinful flesh or gave rest to the planet, which means what? That 11Q13 would be labeled as an unfulfilled prophecy from the vantage point of prior jubilees that cannot be linked together in a typical or type format, right? But manage to come together as the 10:10 counterfeit of Zechariah 8:23. And just as God said in the completion of Revelation 17:12-16, right? And fact is that would have to be seen from a Jubilee perspective, or Tikkun Olam, which is the intended repair to improve the world. Oh, But wait a second. Chat, I'm just going to say chat. Chat says they are similar but unrelated. This makes sense because a true Jubilee accomplishes the purpose and purposes of He who made, whereas the historical Jubilees were interfered with interfered with by way of the captivity of the heritage of Jacob. The only way of ascertaining the correctness of 11Q13 as a prophetic event and the Day of Atonement would be not by way of its historical links with past Jubilees, but by way of the concept of 10 or 10th being final and complete, without the hindrances of the weakness of God's people, who were following a divine blueprint of giving the land a respite from farming. And there is debt relief or forgiveness from indebtedness, the Jubilee known as the Shemitah. So the 11Q13 concept derives its meaning not from a human successive aspect, but by the completeness of the number 10 at the 11th hour of the prophetic time clock, just prior to the end of the working day. And Scripture says that is at the 12th hour or 6 p.m., when no man can work. John 9:4. This is also the true message of document 11Q13 in Melchizedek and the Day of Atonement, with what is known is the knowledge of eternal righteousness at the 11th hour or 5 p.m., which is now, and then ends at 6 p.m. as seen in Revelation 15:8, which says, "And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled." Conclusion. 11Q13 reveals that the biblical final atonement, and this is not about character perfection or human mitzvahs, but is all about the eternal righteousness of He who made, who being Melchizedek, who had no father or mother or beginning of days nor end of life. This means the conclusion about Melchizedek and his prerequisites is true. And what does that do? It is the demolishing, obliteration of the law of one doctrine. The law of one is fully front and central of God the Eternal Son, which is the mega deadly heresies. So from another perspective, the 10th day of the 7th month was the Day of Atonement, and the Jubilee was, as Scripture said, announced by trumpets. The evangelical contribution says the 10th Jubilee equals Daniel's 490 years, ending in 34 AD, Psalms 82:1 and Isaiah 61:1. And yet he who made confirmed their house was left desolate, Matthew 23:38. It could be said to be the type, but Laodiceans know the antitypical Day of Atonement never commenced until Daniel 8:13-14, which was in 1844. Ending that long era includes the 5 fallen kings, transgression of desolation, but not the 6th or 7th king. The detractors, the evangelical larlars, are always stuck in a mire with their literal type, and will never see and still don't know or want to be bothered to know the antitypical Day of Atonement, right? So why should they claim a Jubilee in any of their selfish concepts and then deny Day of Atonement and the sanctuary doctrine in the process? If that doesn't stick in your craw, what will? But then when you look at doctrine or of Jubilee, Larlars speak out of the sides of their mouths to milk the principle of the Shemitah 10th Jubilee for its money's worth. And yeah, it means a lot of money, indebtedness, a massive wealth reset and redistribution of wealth ensues. But hang on, the Larlars get their wish of a jubilee of debt forgiveness and have this reckoned with July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of We the People. And as it so happens, their jubilee count is from reckoning arising from 1776 is 1776 or 250 years or 50 times 50 years, a jubilee continuum. which is incredible. Because in their version of events, it will bring forth a great awakening and then the golden age. But hey, they cannot have their cake and eat the rest. Why? The Larlars will never see seven king priest alliance. Connects to the 10th Jubilee, this side of the loud cry of Revelation 18:1-5. Why? It is because of their denial. What denial? The doctrine of the dual atonement, which is central to the Jubilee, but also must include the order of Melchizedek, right? But God said something to you, that the missing Jubilees were lost, because it was interrupted by the transgression of desolation. Involving who? The purple hag and her king consorts, right? And this 1290 years of transgression of desolation is an extremely long break in Jubilee cycles. But the desolation was the removal of Christ after the order of the ministration of Melchizedek. And as any regular reader of Daniel can see, the transgression of desolation concluded the 2300 years. And then the commencement of the heavenly antitype of the Day of Atonement in Daniel 8:14, 1844, which was and is known as the sixth feast on the 10th day of the seventh month, and involves beyond any question what? The answer is the purpose of John 4:22. That biblical fact replaces the literal 70 times 7 years of the 490 years of Daniel 9 that the Larlars have invested a lot of effort to establish and prove their case of Jubilee interpretations. But further, what the transgression of desolation debunks is their theology of Jubilees. Why? The famous answer is that all Larlars, everyone, all say the atonement was finished at the cross. So the reasoning is bonkers, right? This is placing the thumb to the nose to the ministration of Christ after the order of Melchizedek in the heavenly sanctuary, and the divine purpose of the cleansing of the sanctuary, the cleansing of the repentant man in the court, in the final atonement ministration, right? So who is kidding who? The Lawlars are kidding themselves. They have no answers how God resolves the sin problem in sinful flesh. They have to come clean with the Bible, no pun intended, to the meaning of the beastly priest-king reign. Through the transgression of desolation, the type, the 1290 years, ending in 1844, right? That, the type is, as God said to Daniel, is at the end of the 1290 years, unto 2300 days, and then the cleansing of the sanctuary. And then there has to be the commencement of the Day of Atonement by Christ as high priest after the order of Melchizedek, right? Which includes the era of the abomination of desolation, Matthew 24:15, the antitypical, right? Further, the events of the apocalypse that arise with the antitypical are described by he who made, and he said it was the abomination of desolation, right? Which is the antitypical. Its duration is 1290 days, and then there is the commencement of the 10th Jubilee in heaven after the 1335 days, right? The Feast of Tabernacles is the seventh feast that begins after the Day of Atonement, right? Die-hard detractors will swear, oh, there is nothing in the 10:10 kings of Revelation 17, or the final seven kings for a 70 years of events, or the 49 years in Jubilee cycles. Irrelevant argument. Why? Larlars just don't see John 4:22. They ignore Hebrews 8:1-5, describing the doctrine of the sanctuary in heaven as a colossal face-saving device. They remain indignant about what? The atonement was completed at the cross, removing the entire need of Christ's ministration at the order of Melchizedek and the ministration of the antitypical Day of Atonement, right? In the process of the Larlar's reasoning, they have done what? They have omitted he who made after the order of Melchizedek as great high priest and supplied that with what? Yep, the doctrine of God the Eternal Son, the omega of deadly heresies. Chained and trapped to what? the law of one God. A huge deception is involved. But who are the wiser? What actually has fully debunked the law of one, theology, and Jubilees? And for that answer is the fact the heritage of Jacob has led to nil Jubilees anyway. And why? Jesus said by the heritage being trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the nations was fulfilled, restoration of the state. Lala's followers in America today take up the 50 years from the Balfour Declaration from 1917 to 67, followed by the next 50 years, 67 to 2017. And what occurred in 2017? Of course, there was the temple coin, a special temple shekel minted in 2017, with King Cyrus and the president on the flip side. And you can see that. Now, let's just open it up. And you click on that link and you can watch that here. And it's the Trump Cyrus and the Third Temple shekel. Okay? Yet no jubilees. But the big deal that overlays the Jubilee stubbornness are the events, the 10 kings of Revelation 17, that dictate important events, such as the termination of the king-priest alliance. And you can read that in Revelation 17:16. And then that fact brings in the rule of Zechariah 8:23. It would then be complementary for them to announce their replacement, an introduction, and they bow to who? The 2 Thessalonians 2 guy, for their 10th Jubilee. To hold the investiture of a newbie priest at the Third Temple Enterprise, the 8th, who is of the 7, and then follows are the promises of Tikkun Olam, 10 Jubilees in light of the 10 horns. And it's important to note, signal that the first 3 horns who fell hosted the man-made concept of one God Arianism, which culminated in self-righteousness, as did the next 7 kings. The 8th, who is of the 7, is in immediate competition of worship with Melchizedek, he who made, for universal supremacy. Otherwise, there is no point of the first angel's warning, right? What is clear that the times of the Gentiles from AD 70 brought rest to the land from self-righteousness and false temple worship. Paul said the whole sacrificial system was demolished, and Jesus said there is established the new vineyard of Matthew 20, and that confirms Hebrews 8, 1-2. The land literally rested from 34 AD to 1948, with the land once again being converted from a wilderness to the beginning of the expansion of the tents of Shem, to a blooming land, fig tree metaphor, described by Christ in Luke 21. The Larlars talk with messianic zeal, yet it's nothing more than fulfillment of Genesis 9:27. So what happened afterwards? The land that had the antitypical rest from the first desolation is, as stated by Jesus himself, reverts to the same process as stated by Jesus himself in the form of the cursed fig tree, its branches turning green. Luke 21:29. The branches are Japheth's descendants, bringing back old cursed fig tree to life of Rabbi Japheth. And in the new vineyard, the same takes place with the true olive tree of Laodicea, with the rich root stock being impacted by the events from both the cursed fig tree as well as from the woman of ill repute. Yet the olive tree with rich root, not the fig, continues to thrive as the seed of remnant of the woman, the Phillies, they being the continuation of the root of the true historical faith, with the natural branches being the Phillies, or the 6 churches, and Laodicea still present, or was. Then the loud cry of Revelation 17:18 occurs, and that brings those wild olive shoots, the lalars, and the many other branches that were formerly natural, can be grafted back into the true olive tree, John 4:22. which is relative to what? The rich root, and that means then all Israel, spiritual Israel, shall be saved. Romans 11:26, which is according to the true olive tree, which is now located outside Palestine land. Yet he who made said, "This return to the rootstock must be in spirit and truth." It says, John 4:23 to 24, "But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. And God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." That worship involves the meaning of the first angel, right? The 10 missing tribes theory has a major problem. It's located within the spirit of and leaven and wine of the former tenants who were booted out in 34 AD. Therefore, their boasting and pride will be centered on the old vineyard, unless brought into Christ's teachings of the new vineyard. And that must be in spirit and truth, with no physical location in which to latch onto as their pride and self-righteousness, and yes, the third temple enterprise, which is measured by Rabbi J and the eighth king by way of what? 7 king priests, false jubilees. And why? It's based on Augustine's theological treatise of the church being the new kingdom of Christ on earth, or New Jerusalem. Since the Augustinian concept of the Roman Catholic Church being the new kingdom on earth, and you can read it here, and while being a false construct, was a true historical idealistic interpretation. This then brings into the picture the transgression of desolation and wilderness scenario of Revelation 12 in relation to the woman of ill repute, whose ideas of these desolations are firmly confirmed by Daniel, but were in fact claimed by the Roman Catholic Church as new revivals of the new Jerusalem on earth, along with God's two vicegerents on earth. And who are they? The world priest and the world monarch, right? The Holy Roman Empire, or grand design of this time-honored tradition, which many past and future politicians consider as being the glue which historically unites all of Europe into patterns of revival and catastrophe, of which, historically speaking, there have been 6 thus far, as well as the final 7th, who is soon on the horizon. God said, Mystery Babylon, mother of harlots, she ceases, described at Revelation 17 and 18. The end of the 7 kings priest jubilees follows the Augustinian treatise of doctrine. But the 8th king enters the picture at Third Temple, and Isaiah 2 that confirms this does not describe a jubilee. So what's the chance of jubilee by the 8th anyway? While it is impossible to infer or claim, one thing is known. This 8th is the king of fierce countenance, who destroys by peace in Daniel 8:25. That's not a jubilee. There's the commencement of a string of 7 trumpets sounding. Those events are desolation and woe. 7 trumpets are the announcements of 3 woes, but in a way, these 7 trumpets are announcing the end of the Day of Atonement in the court that is not measured. Then following are the 7 last plagues, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. 10th Jubilee conclusion. The 10th Jubilee makes no sense on account of all the interruptions. 11Q13 properly identifies Melchizedek from Psalms 110:1-4. So if Melchizedek is Elohim deity as seen and known from 11Q13, then the concept of 10 entails completeness of heaven's Day of Atonement rather than human successions, right? There is no evidence of succession of previous jubilees. When Jesus opened the scroll and read about the captives being freed, there was some fulfillment, but the rest of the picture had to include the Day of Atonement, right? As in the final Day of Atonement, and fully in reference to eternal righteousness of He who made, which brings into the picture of completeness. What the 7 prophetic map confirms is they are not the Jubilee cycles, but the incomplete nature of the Melchizedek, a counterfeit This is a valid assessment, since Satan's historical utilization of the 10 kings in the Arian and then with Papa Pointyhat demonstrates human weakness and non-eternal righteousness concepts in reference to the blueprint of the Godhead, which is the first angel in verity and is all about the eternal righteousness of He who made. Not the Triune Trinity or God the Eternal Son, the Omega of deadly heresies.